So our event today is going to take the form of a conversation with me and our guest, Marc Baer. I'm going to introduce him first, then I'm going to sit down and ask him some questions. So let me start by telling you that our guest today is the author of a truly remarkable book called German, Jew, Muslim, Gay, The Life and Times of Hugo Marcus. And our guest is also remarkable. Marc Baer has a PhD from the University of Chicago. He's a professor of international history at the London School of Economics and Political Science, the author of 6 books, and the winner of so many impressive prizes. Like, each book has won at least, I think, more than one prize. I just want to mention 2 really outstanding publications and awards. One is his book, Honored by the Glory of Islam, Conversion and Conquest in Ottoman Europe, which won the Albert Hourani Prize for the best book in Middle East Studies. And also he's the author of Sultanic Saviors and Tolerant Turks, Writing Ottoman Jewish History, Denying the Armenian Genocide, which won the Dr. Sona Aronian Book Prize for Excellence in Armenian Studies. Many, many other publications and contributions. But today we're going to focus on his book published in 2020. And before I tell you a little bit about the book, please join me in welcoming Professor Marc David Baer.
Thank you, Doris.
Thank you. So what a pleasure to have you here. And you can see here, I'm showing the book cover there. And I took that sentence from the book, gives you like just a little nutshell. Hugo Marcus, aka Hamid, Hans Alienus, Dr. Hans Marco, and Hugo Israel. Quote, the only figure to have played an important role in the gay rights movement and in establishing Islam in Germany. So I want to tell you a little bit about Hugo Marcus, so you know what our conversation is about, before I turn to you with the first question. I made this little timeline. I won't read it all, but it's really important to know Hugo Marcus, born in 1880 in Posen, what's now Poznan, died 1966 in Switzerland. So you can see there exactly, almost exactly in the middle of his life, he converted to Islam. And you can see a man of many interests, studied philosophy, joined Magnus Hirschfeld's Scientific Humanitarian Committee to campaign for gay rights, was a member of the Stefan George Circle. Anybody in German studies knows about that, and joined the Ahmadi movement for the propagation of Islam before formally converting. And you can see there the mosque in Berlin, which was affiliated with the Ahmadi movement, opened in 1927. Hugo Marcus was the editor of all their German language publications, including many, many important publications such as the Quran, just for starters. And then you could see arrested, sent to Sachsenhausen, was able to get into Switzerland, continued writing and publishing homoerotic fiction and nonfiction. So a really incredible and unusual individual. And let me just start by asking, how did you come to write a book about Hugo Marcus? It's quite different from the other works that you've written.
That's true. I'm a historian of the Ottoman Empire by training, and I was living in Berlin. I was actually looking at, I was studying Turks in Germany during the Weimar and also Nazi Germany. And I discovered that the leading Turkish citizen in Germany in the 1930s was a descendant of Jewish converts to Islam. Now, he wasn't just a descendant of any group of Jewish converts to Islam, but a group that I'd written a book about called the Dönme, or the Believers. These were the followers of the messianic claimant Shabbatai Tzvi way back in the 17th century. So in the 17th century, there was this Jewish spiritualist, Shabbatai Tzvi, who Jews around the world believed was the Messiah. And after he was called to the palace, the Sultan said, okay, so if you're the Messiah, then you won't have a problem surviving the flaming arrows from my bowsmen. And he said, well, what's the other choice? And the Sultan said, well, you could become a Muslim, and then you won't have to go through. He said, okay, I'll become a Muslim. Now, in Jewish history, when Jewish history is full of messianic figures, usually they're beheaded and things happen to them, other than Jesus, right? We know what happened to Jesus, actually. So this is actually the second biggest messianic movement after Jesus. So the Sultan becomes a Muslim. I'm sorry, that's what wanted to happen.
Yeah,
No,
exactly.
the messianic figure becomes a Muslim. So surprisingly, hundreds of his Jewish followers also converted to Islam instead of just saying, oh, he's a charlatan, all that. They found reasons to secretly go underground, undercover as Muslims. And they lived that way for centuries. So I wrote a book about that group from their foundation in 1666 all the way into the 1950s. So I was following them in Germany, and I realized that this one character was actually a member of the group. So I wrote an article about that and his fate. He was officially a Muslim. He was a Turkish citizen, and he was the leader of the Turkish-German Chamber of Commerce. But because he was of Jewish background, the Nazis started going after him. And the Nazis raided his store and took all his goods. So Turkey actually whisked him out of the country and saved his life, in fact, as a Turk, not as a Jew, but as a Turkish citizen. Okay, fair enough. So I'm researching this very exciting story. And then I realize that across town, in the only purpose-built mosque in Germany, there's a real convert who's running the show. So the leading German Muslim in Nazi Germany was a Jewish convert to Islam. So I decided, well, this is too good to pass up. And I myself, I was bar mitzvahed in Germany. I grew up in part in Germany. So I already had an interest in things German and Jewish. I thought this is too good of a story. So then I spent the next 12 years, actually it took me 12 years to research and write this book. And here we have it.
Yeah, it's a remarkable book. And as you could tell from the title, like you stress those four different interwoven aspects, really, of Marcus's life. And again, I'll just read the sentence from the introduction. You can all see it there. German, Jew, Muslim, gay is the first biography devoted to examining the life of a German born as Hugo Marcus, who became the Muslim Hamid, who the Nazis forced to be renamed Israel, a gay man who never called himself gay, but fought for homosexual rights, who chose to write gay fiction under the pen name Hans Alienus during his decades of Swiss exile. Thinking about those four components, I was so struck in reading your book by how just brilliantly you interweave them, like from the very beginning. And I wonder if you could tell a bit about how did you decide which order those four attributes, those four interconnected, interlocking attributes should appear in the title?
Yeah, it was very difficult actually to come up with this title, almost as difficult as it was to find a publisher for the book. As you can imagine, this book was not popular amongst different groups. So German Muslims are proud of Marcus because he was a convert, but when it comes to him being gay, this is a real sore spot. And they tell me, okay, but he was gay, but it was all theoretical. I said, well, I have all his love letters. Okay, so that's going to make me very unpopular. And then, and for Jewish studies, actually, to write about a man who converts to Islam is also not a popular thing. There's half a dozen biographies of Magnus Hirschfeld, who he was the assistant to, and he's the famous gay rights activist and gay and German man. But that's a story that in Jewish studies we tell. We tell of Jews who are gay and persecuted. That's an easy story to tell. But then to talk about a man who also was a German patriot, he was not left-wing. Right. So Marcus doesn't fit any of the stereotypes we have. So Kurt Hiller, you've heard of Kurt Hiller, younger than Hirschfeld, another gay rights activist, another socialist, another left-wing Jew who's persecuted by Nazi Germany. Again, there's several biographies of him in German. And there's a where I used to live in Berlin, in Schöneberg, there's actually a Kurt Hiller Platz with a statue and everything. But again, those are stories that we're used to telling. But here's a conservative German man who becomes Muslim. He's a German patriot. He stays in Nazi Germany until 1939, until less than 2 weeks before war breaks out. Why? Because he's working on the Quran translation, right? He's single-mindedly trying to finish that book, right? So he's not a typical person. And so how did we arrange these? I mean, German, he's always, in his mind, he's always German. Now the Nazis don't accept that, right? The Nazis say that he can't be German, but that's also why he doesn't leave Germany. He can't believe that. I mean, this is his homeland, even though he's from Imperial Germany. He's from Posen, which becomes Poznan, Poland. He's a German through and through. There's I'll come back to that. But then being Jewish is also something that he keeps with him his whole life. Even though he converts to Islam, he maintains many Jewish aspects of his thinking. So even his understanding of Islam is a German Jewish view of Islam from that time period, from the 19th and 20th century. German Jews believed that Islam was rational, it was tolerant, it was the religion of science, and there were quite a few famous German Jewish Orientalists who wrote book after book saying that Islam was actually Judaism, the monotheism that Judaism had lost with all of its modern shtuyos, all the modern trappings. So this is also something very Jewish about him. He maintains very close relations with his Jewish mother, even though he's gay. Even though his lover is a 15-year younger Catholic boy for most of his life, he maintains close relations with his mother, and he uses his gay and Muslim contacts to get her out of Nazi Germany after the war starts. So in December 1939, he actually rescues his ailing, fragile mother from Berlin. She would have been murdered very quickly. He gets her out just as he used his gay and his Muslim contacts to get him into Switzerland to save his life. He does the same with his mother. So he keeps the Jewish context. In Switzerland, he is very close to his cousin, who's Jewish, and they remain close to the end of his life. Muslim is also part of his identity. I don't know about his practice. I don't know if he prayed or fasted. I don't know. But he did when he was in Berlin at the mosque. Afterwards, I don't know, in exile. And then gay, gay is something that, again, it's not a word that he used. He's a man of a generation. He was born in 1880. Those men, almost none of them would call themselves homosexual or gay. Yet there's no doubt that in all of his writing and in his life and his friendships that he loved men. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. And I'm interested in you foregrounding the German part, because one of the things that took me by surprise with this book is what a central role Goethe plays in this book. I didn't expect that just from the cover, but from the very first page. And again, here I took a sentence from the introduction just so you could see. Hugo Marcus saw Goethe as his pole star, model German, model gay, and model Muslim, whose life and writing offered a solution to Germany's cultural crisis. So I thought the idea of like Germany's, I don't know, most famous poet being somehow at the center of Hugo Marcus's story is something I'd like to hear you tell us more about.
Right. Now, this isn't to say that Goethe was gay or that he was Muslim, right? I'm not saying that. But in German Muslims today will tell you that Goethe was a Muslim. And Marcus was convinced that Goethe was a Muslim. And Marcus, and there are literary scholars who look at the homoeroticism in Goethe's writing. And for Marcus, that meant that Goethe loved men as he did. So again, and he's nothing's more, Germany's greatest genius of all time, Goethe, right? So Marcus used his writing to model his own writing and his own life even. So Goethe, let's talk about Goethe then just briefly. So Goethe lived 18th and 19th century. He was a polymath, right? He wrote poetry, he wrote fiction, he wrote nonfiction, he wrote essays. At the time, people believed that Goethe was a prophet. And for that reason, Goethe sat down to write a book about prophecy and the difference between prophets and poets. And that inspired him then to begin a tragedy about Muhammad. And you can imagine in 18th, 19th century Germany and Central Europe, Muhammad wasn't well known. Of course, there are a lot of stereotypes and crazy ideas about Muhammad, the man, the prophet. So he began to write this tragedy, and he did not complete it, actually. But he did write a poem, which was a very spiritual poem about Muhammad, the prophet, uniting with the forces of the spiritual forces of the world and the natural forces, the lakes and the rivers and the mountains and so on, and just carrying humanity forward into a new age. So this is an actual poem he published when he was young, called Muhammad's Gazang. So he did have these writings. And then, of course, we know Goethe wrote East-West Divan, which is well known, which is a book of poetry in which Goethe, the modern poet, takes on a 10th century personality, a Persian poet, and writes this book of poetry as if he's a medieval Muslim. All right. So now, in order to advertise that book, he actually went around in a turban and he told people he was a Muslim and this kind of thing. So people today take that at face value, that he was a Muslim. He wasn't actually a Muslim. But what he was someone who was open-minded to all religions and who himself actually practiced no religion. But so he did write these, and he also studied the Quran, a translation of the Quran into German. And so Marcus went and read that same German translation to try to get into touch in a way with Goethe. So that's where the Muslim part comes through. The gay part comes through again. Goethe, if any of you have studied Goethe's work, he wrote a number of his works have what today are taken as gay characters very clearly. The character of Mignon in one of his studies. I'm thinking of it in German. Wilhelm Meister's Lehrjahr, right? So I think Mignon is in that, and this is a gay character in modern interpretation. But also Goethe wrote, again, this beautiful, beautiful poetry, this homoerotic poetry, where it's very clear that the beloved is a man. There's no doubt about that. So Marcus took this also as a sign. And Marcus brought these two things together. So he wrote erotic poetry. No, it's not poetry, erotic verse about his imam, actually, right? So he brought, never published, it'll never be published. The person who publishes it will be not liked. But so he wrote this kind of material, trying to bring these two aspects together.
I wanted to also say, you write something in your book like, for Marcus, Islam was mediated through Goethe, right? Can you just say a little bit more about that? Because I was curious, you said like he read the translation of the Quran. Like, did he know Arabic?
No.
Did he read the Quran in Arabic?
No. His is a very German Islam. And there's actually a mosque in there's actually a couple I don't want to say anything bad about anybody, but there are some Germans who believe that they do everything better. Maybe you've come across this attitude before, right? So we were the worst at committing genocide. We're the best at, making amends for it, right? There are German Muslims they're converts, and they think that they're better Muslims than Arabs or Turks in Germany. So they create their own mosque, right? They think they know how to be Muslims best. So this is the same kind of attitude that Marcus had. So he didn't think he had to read any Muslim thinkers on Islam or Muslim interpreters, but that he could have his own kind of Protestant Islam, that he could look at the Holy Book in translation, he could interpret it his own way. And so that's why Marcus actually comes up. I wrote an article about his own interpretation of Islam, which was an Islam that no one else could really follow. Because Sunni Muslims have 5 pillars of the faith, pilgrimage and belief in one God and all these things, and fasting and so on, prayer, almsgiving. Marcus completely came up with his own 5 pillars, right? And one of those pillars is beauty, right? People need to live beauty in their lives. And this is in this thing of beauty, this is where he then writes about how men are the most beautiful humans as opposed to women, right? So this is what he's doing in his interpretation.
Let's go to the second attribute again in the order that you put them. German, Jew, Muslim, gay, I was really interested in the ways in which Hugo Marcus's sort of Jewish trajectory is really sadly very typical, right? And again, I put this passage here, I'll read it. It's from after the war. He wrote a short post-war summary of his life, and this quoted from you, but quoting from him. On November 9th, 1938, I was sent to concentration camp Oranienburg, Sachsenhausen during the general persecution of Jews. On the day of release, those who were being released were strongly urged in 3 speeches to leave Germany post haste, because otherwise they would disappear forever in a concentration camp. I delayed my exit from the country until August 23rd, 1939, out of consideration for my then 85-year-old mother, whom I wanted to take with me. My mother and I abandoned our assets to my brother, Dr. Alfred Marcus, to protect him and his wife as much as possible from need. But my brother was deported to Theresienstadt on May 17th, 1943, and his assets were seized. He died in that place. I have always been a Jew and can verify that I never renounced my affiliation with Judaism. I wonder, can you tell us more, even both about that text itself, but deeper in the surface, like what can you get from his life? How did his sense of being a Jew change over time? And what can you find?
Well, again, he joined the Islamic group called the Ahmadi, right? The Ahmadiyya. We have them, of course, we have them in London, we have them here. So the Ahmadi at that time in the 1920s believed that you didn't have to leave your other faith to join Islam. And that's what they actually promoted. So people could still be Christian or Jewish and be Muslim. Now, I don't know if there's any Muslims today who would say that, but in the 1920s, when they were looking for converts in Germany, that's what they told people. And you could read their journal at the time and their sermons and so on, and so Marcus, in a way, Marcus did not, in Germany, also today, it's still this way today, you actually have to register to be a member of a recognized religion. And then the state takes taxes from you, and then those taxes go to that religious institution. So you could be Jewish, Protestant, or Catholic in Germany. You can't be Muslim. It's not recognized yet. So anyway, so Marcus then was supposed to resign, or I don't know what the right word is, but to quit Judaism, but he didn't. He still is a tax-paying, what have you, member of the Jewish community after his conversion in 1925. He only legally and actually ceases being a Jew in 1936. So 3 years after the Nazis come to power. And that's only because of the problems that the Gestapo was giving to his mosque community. Because in Germany after 1935, Jews and people who weren't Jewish weren't allowed to socialize or to mix, and Jews weren't allowed to have any positions in society. He was fired from all the journals where he was writing, a newspaper writer. He also, he was head of the German Muslim Association, but he wasn't supposed to be because he was a Jew, even if he converted, right? According to these racist laws. So so it wasn't until 1936 when he did that. And that was only because he had to. So that's what he's saying in the 1958, when he's writing this, he's writing this, about his life. So it's also the case that his brother, he had 2 brothers, both were murdered by the Nazis, right? So
suicide.
His other brother committed suicide 10 years before that brother. So his experience is very similar to that of other German Jews at the time. He had relatives in Israel, but Marcus, again, he is an anti-Zionist, right? So he doesn't fit in the different molds that maybe we'd like to see him fit into, right? So maybe it was possible for him actually to immigrate to Israel, but in 1932 actually, and this is where things get so interesting for me, and where history is so complicated, right? In 1932, he's one of the 4 founding members of Al-Hajj Amin al-Husseini's World, I forget the name of it, World Congress for Muslims or what have you, right? So here, so here is a Jew aligning himself against the Zionists with the one man that anyone ever thinks about when they think of Nazis, Muslims, and the Holocaust, al-Husseini, the Mufti of Palestine. And the other three people who he joined with, one was a Nazi supporting Muslim from India. The other one was one of his fellow converts from his generation, an older man. So again, he's a very complicated figure.
Earlier, you said that his version of Islam did carry with it traces of his Judaism. Can you expound on that a little bit?
Well, again, I think it's his perception of Islam as being pure monotheism. That's the main takeaway we have from all these German Jewish Orientalists and thinkers from the 19th century, and he carries that with him. And he has many articles where he writes about this. He also says Islam is a religion of philosophy. Well, yes and no. Yes and no. It is and it isn't. Is Judaism the religion of philosophy? Yes and no, right? There were great philosophers in our past, and there were people who were against philosophy because, right? There are those who use philosophy to prove the religion and so on. So, but he takes the track of sort of the medieval Andalusian idea of Muslims and Jews together being philosophers. And he writes about Spinoza, another famous Jew who left Judaism, right? So in some ways, he almost sees himself as a Spinoza figure.
And where did he publish the work about Spinoza?
Well, in German, in the journal of the mosque journal, right?
Okay, so yeah, German Jew. The third category is Muslim. And this part of the book, well, first I have to back up and say why it is that I even got the idea to invite you for this talk, which I told you earlier. I teach a course called Religion and Violence, and a student in my class, Muslim student here at the University of Toronto, told me that she wanted to do a project on the Holocaust. She was like, I always work on Muslim topics because that's my background. I want to do something different. So she started some project, but it didn't really grab her. She said, I want to do something that is connected to Muslims and the Holocaust. But when she searched, everything that she found was either al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti, who, is attributed with, his connection with Hitler and so on, or the Bosnian SS Muslim unit. Like it was all, and she said it was all through the prism of conflict, Israel-Palestinian conflict. Everything was like fed back. And then she found the article by Professor Baer about Hugo Marcus. And it was like transformative, like a completely different way. Anyways, so I was thinking about that. She couldn't be here today, but wanted to, that it's really intriguing that Marcus was active in the mosque community, giving public lectures here in 1937. So I wanted to read just this passage and then ask you to talk a bit more about this particular part of the book. You can see yourself in November 1937, Jewish convert Marcus spoke at the mosque again. He was given the honor to deliver the Ahmadi community's farewell address to Sadr ud-Din. Marcus used the opportunity to allude to the fallen status of the Jews of Germany by discussing the untouchables of India, thanking the Ahmadi for raising their position in society through conversion to Islam. Marcus argues that Islam restored their human dignity. He may also have been making a plea for the Nazi members of the congregation and the Gestapo spies among them to recognize that the Brotherhood of Islam pays no heed to race. There's so much going on in that passage, 1937. Can you tell us a bit more about that mosque, about its specificities, and how it is that Marcus is there? November 1937, Hossbach Memorandum. Anybody from my class here? Like, this is really like quite surprising. And so please.
And it's 2 years after the Nuremberg laws, so he shouldn't be giving public addresses, right? He should be quiet, right? Jews had all these laws against them, so a lot is going on here. So when I started to write this book, I was very frustrated because everything written about Muslims and the Holocaust was about Arabs. And actually, it wasn't all about Arabs, it was about Palestinians. It wasn't just about Palestinians, it was about one man, right? Al-Husseini. Now, Al-Husseini was he was an ally of Hitler. There's no question. He was, Britain, of course, was a colonial power in Palestine. He was opposed to Jewish state, the Yishuv being constructed there. So he saw Hitler as an ally, but he went beyond that. So he went to Berlin, and then he recorded, or he gave talks over Nazi radio in Arabic.
Lived in Berlin.
He lived in Berlin. He also was very, very close with Himmler, who was the real architect of the Holocaust. He knew exactly what was happening. Himmler told him exactly what they were doing to the Jews, that they told him exactly about the annihilation of the Jews. And the Mufti said, well, stop sending Jews to, don't let Jews, leave Europe, because they'll come to Palestine, and we don't want them there. But knowing fully well, after Himmler told him exactly what that meant for the Jews who wouldn't be able to allow Europe. He also helped set up the SS, the armed division of Muslims in Bosnia. He also set up the Imam training school for those imams. So it's very clear that he's a clear collaborator, and he's no doubt about that. I wouldn't take that away. And there were some other Arabs as well, and there are also Indian nationalists and others who were allies with Hitler, knowing full well what the Nazis were doing to the Jews. There's no question about that. But then I was thinking, well, why should? But there's a large spectrum. Just like if we were to ask the question, what was the Christian response to the Nazis? There's a large spectrum, right? There's people who became Nazis. There's people who resisted the Nazis, people who fought the Nazis, and so on. The Muslims were the same way. It's just a smaller group of people in Europe at the time. So now what's different about the Ahmadi is that they're British subjects. They're British subjects. They all will have to leave the country when war breaks out in 1939, or they'll be incarcerated. So they all have to go back to India. But they're there for the first 6 years of the Nazi period. They're South Asian, right? They're not Arabs. They're South Asians. And they have a unique view on interreligious tolerance. So Sadr ad-Din, this fellow here, the Imam, the founder of the mosque in Berlin, he gives lectures in liberal Jewish synagogues. He has acquaintances who are Jewish at the time, right? So they're missionaries. They want people to become Muslim, so they're very open and tolerant to other groups. So that's something to think about. With this particular group is different. But so that's what I wanted to do. I wanted, because I'm also a scholar of the Ottoman Empire and Turks, and so Islam is not just the religion of the Arabs, so it's like, we have to think about other peoples who are Muslim in their histories as well. So that's part of it. So he gives this lecture in which he compares, it's not there explicitly, but it's clear that he's comparing Jews in Germany of his time with the untouchables of India, which is a brave thing to do. But it's also the case that the South Asians in his mosque, the Ahmadi, are also doing what they can to speak up for brotherhood and for peace at that time.
And can you tell a little bit more about the conflicts within the mosque community and the kind of pressures? Because I believe I'm remembering right from your book that actually Marcus was the only, at least the most prominent Jewish convert, but yet his presence was something the Gestapo used to say, okay, we got to shut down this mosque.
It's full of Jews. Yeah, right.
And then conflicts, can you talk a bit more about that internal community, who was in that?
Well, there's a generational conflict within the mosque. So the young German men are becoming Nazis, but the older men of Marcus' generation, 40, 50, and so on, don't tend to. So they're patriots, right? They're conservative, but they're not joining the party. But the young hotheads are joining the party, and they're telling the Gestapo, look, Marcus is here, and so on. The big conflict, though, in Berlin was between the Ahmadi, this group, and the Sunni Muslims. Now, I'm not going to say whether Ahmadi are Sunni or not. I'm not going to determine who's a true Muslim, whatever. But Sunni Muslims in Berlin at the time declared that the Ahmadi were not real Muslims, that they were the real Muslims. But the Ahmadi were the ones who built the mosque. They didn't have a mosque. They didn't have any, they didn't, you know, so they had to also pray at the Ahmadi mosque if they wanted a proper mosque facing the right direction of prayer and so on. So they always were trying to take over the mosque. They were always before the Nazis rose to power in Weimar, Germany, they also wanted to take over the mosque. But then when the Nazis came to power, they saw an ally. And they eventually would take over the mosque after 1939. They would get their hands on it. And they would have this one Sunni Muslim organization would be the only legal Muslim organization in the country. So they were using the Nazis to accomplish their religious goals.
And just like a nuts and bolts question, because I realized a lot of people, maybe you're surprised to know that there is a mosque in Berlin in 1937 to begin with. Can you just tell us a bit about who were the Muslims in Berlin in the 1920s and 30s?
I mean, Muslims have been in Germany for a really long time. Since the 18th century, you know, Muslims have been living in Germany. There are Bosnian soldiers and so on. But the first real permanent Muslim community is established after the First World War. So during the First World War, the German army had actually built a mosque for the use of prisoners of war at a prisoner of war camp. So that was actually the first purpose-built mosque in Germany. But it wasn't built by Muslims. It was for propaganda purposes by them. After the war ends, most of these Muslims went back to their home countries, wherever they were, France, for example, Russia, but some stayed. And they continued to use that mosque. But German officials were very unhappy with that.
Wait, where was that one?
Outside of Berlin, a train right away in what is the East Berlin, in Zossen. But Germany didn't know how to deal with the fact that they were actually living, practicing Muslims anymore. So they tore the mosque down. And it's around this time after the war, then the Muslims have no proper house of prayer. They have to rent out different spaces. So, but the Ahmadi, who are well-funded from India, they build a mosque in England. Now they come to Germany after the war, and they're able to build this mosque in a very nice. It's still a nice neighborhood in Fährberliner Platz. It's a middle-class German neighborhood. So they build this mosque, but they make it look like the Taj Mahal, which is a little bit odd, seeing that they want, you know, to sort of blend in and so on. But anyway, but they build the mosque. It's still there. You could pray there on Fridays if you want today.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to the fourth of, I guess, those interwoven attributes, gay. You already mentioned the relationship with Hugo Marcus and Magnus Hirschfeld. And by the way, I don't know if you've seen the new book about Hirschfeld and Li Shu Tong by Lauren Marhofer, right? Racism and the Making of Gay Rights. Hirschfeld's companion, Chinese man who, you know, yeah, exactly. Super interesting. Anyways, I wanted to just bring out this passage, which comes at the conclusion or near the very end. And I have to say, I found it so, I don't know, moving. In 1965, quote, on the 30th anniversary of Hirschfeld's death, an 85-year-old Marcus offered this rousing declaration. Magnus Hirschfeld died of a stroke in May 14th, 1935, in exile in Nice, driven there by an ignominious injustice. The most beautiful task remains to continue his great work of liberation internationally and more effectively than he was able to achieve at the time. In your book, which is organized chronologically, in some ways it is the gay theme that pulls through almost the most consistently, right? So I wonder, can you talk about that?
Yeah, already at the age of 20, in 1900, he published his first novella. It's a homoerotic novella. It's hard to find today, but there are copies in a few obscure German libraries. So already as a young man, also around that time, around 1900, he also joins Hirschfeld's organization, which is the world's first gay rights organization. And then he works as his assistant in Berlin. And then all the way through the 1920s, even after he converts to Islam, he's going to help draft the petitions that are given to the justice minister to repeal a notorious Wilhelmine Imperial Germany statute that equates gay sex with bestiality and penalizes men for those relations. So for 25 years or so, actually even into the early 30s, he's the one who's helping write and rewrite this petition to get this law off the books. So he's writing fiction, but he's also an activist, and he's an activist in the way he could be an activist at that time, which was to get the laws changed. But he also would continue to write short stories throughout his life. It was only though after he is in Swiss exile where he's able to publish a lot of the work that he'd written contemporaneously, but also earlier in his life, short stories, poems, nonfiction, and so on. Because even during the war, Zurich remains probably the most open city in Europe for gay men. And that's where a journal called Der Kreis, the Circle, was published. And Marcus, as soon as he flees to Basel, Switzerland, which is where the journal was based, in 1939, then he writes for it. He writes for the journal all the way until 1965, on the eve of his death. And again, they'll publish his work there. And it's also, but the Kreis was also, as you can imagine, it's a circle, right? It's a social circle. So it was a place where gay men could be together. Gay men were still being murdered in Switzerland at that time. Well, today too, right? It's not over. So gay men were still being murdered, even though if they had more legal rights in Switzerland than anywhere else in Europe, and where they would be free earlier than any other place in Europe, in fact, before Germany. Still, it was a place for him to live the life that he wanted to live. So apparently he's living as a Muslim, although in isolation. He has no social contacts with other Muslims after the Second World War in Switzerland, but he has this circle of friends and he has his Jewish relatives.
One of the things that surprised me about the book is that you have this amazing photograph on the cover. I'm going to go back to it. The photograph of Hugo Marcus himself on the cover, which you describe in the book, taken in 1900 in Italy, right?
On the Isle of Capri.
Yeah, exactly. So like at that sort of key moment in his life. And you describe a number of other photographs and images, both of him, of his lover, Roman, right? But none of them are in the book. And I was wondering why. Like it seemed like the visual aspect is so important, especially for like the homoerotic themes and so on. I was just curious, why did none of those photographs make it in the book? Maybe just technical issues?
First of all, it's an academic book. And I've stopped writing academic books. Now my next book will be about the history of Jewish-Muslim relations. It's a timely subject from Arabia in the 7th century till today in London, where I live. So I think I need to write that book. But that will be a non-academic book, so I'll be able to have pictures. And my last non-academic book about the Ottomans, I had 25 pictures. This is an academic book, so there's zero, But I wanted to publish, one thing I wanted to publish was the Christ-like image of his lover Roman, which is a painting which I've seen, but the owner of the painting owns it, and he wasn't going to let me.
Who painted it and when? Because I think it does come up in the book a few times, right? And there was a portrait of Roman that his mother. How does?
But also, I also didn't have permission to publish the portrait of Marcus, which was made by a lesbian Jewish painter, a feminist who was murdered in Theresienstadt. Julie Wolfthorn. She was murdered in 1944. So she painted him in the mosque office, and it's an incredibly vibrant. And her paintings were usually of nude nymphs and young women and beautiful red-haired women and so on. But she chose to paint Marcus, which is an intriguing subject. And she says it was actually her famous portrait that she ever made. And again, I can't show it. I can't show it. It's actually, the original is actually missing, to be honest. We have photographs of the original in someone's house somewhere, I'm sure. The original was given. He left it in Berlin because he fled to Switzerland, and he wanted someone to give it. Roman, his lover, had it, owned it, and he was very ill after the war. He was a gay man. He was mistreated in the war, but he wasn't put in a concentration camp. But he had the painting, and he was going to give it to someone, a writer who was going to bring it to Switzerland, but it never. I don't think it happened. So the painting is lost. But the painting of Roman was was stunning because, again, it shows Roman after the war. He's very gaunt, he's very thin. Like I said, he's very Christ-like, and the light is coming in through the window, glowing through him. But again, I found that in Germany, talked to the owner. He said, no, you can't publish it.
Yeah, well, what can I say? I really was struck by the descriptions of the images. So that's why I thought, academic or book or not, it would have been great to see them, but now I understand. Now I understand why. So I want to ask one, I guess, really just last question, and then we're going to take questions from all of you. Hopefully you have some. And that's what I was thinking, really, we can end by, something you've already alluded to, thinking about both this topic, Marcus, the book, and even our event, and how different it looks, even if we had done this event last year, right? When we thought about it after the October 7th attacks and all the, issues since. And I was thinking that already in the book, when you wrote it, you did in the introduction really situate it so, I thought, so compellingly in current discussions about the Holocaust memory, who's included, what's the relationship of Jews, Muslims, and the Holocaust. And so I picked out this quote. You've touched on some of these issues, but I think there's a lot more to be said. And again, tell us a bit about how your book is located now, published 3 years ago. So let me read the quote. Including Jewish converts to Islam and their descendants within the history of Muslim communities helps break down the reified frameworks of Muslim and Jew. The fact that converts adopted a mix of Jewish and Muslim beliefs, practices, and identities challenges their conventional depiction. Marcus was not an isolated case. Other Jewish intellectuals, you name them, converted to Sunni Islam in Berlin in the 1920s. Unlike these men, however, Marcus became a prominent Muslim in Germany while retaining membership in the Jewish community. His religious identity should give us cause to rethink where the boundary between Muslim and Jew lies, especially in historical eras when the definition of belonging was a matter of life and death. So yeah, what are your thoughts now about this book and how it resonates?
Well, again, there were about 3 important Jewish converts to Islam in Berlin in 1925, 26, 27. And there were biographies about the other ones. And one of them is very well known, Muhammad Assad. His name was Leopold Weiss. He was Ukrainian Jewish. His grandfather was a rabbi, and so on. And he went on to become a very important 20th century Muslim philosopher. He also was the Pakistani ambassador to the UN, right? So he was someone who believed that you could not be Muslim and European. You couldn't be. They're two opposite. So he left. He was actually from Austria, but still, he left German-speaking Europe. He goes to Saudi Arabia, marries a woman, goes around with a keffiyeh and a robe and so on, speaks only Arabic, but that's not good enough. Then he goes to Pakistan, does the same thing. He wishes to leave all traces of Europe and Jewishness behind, but he can't, of course. So then he is incarcerated. He's a Austrian citizen, so he's in British India during the Second World War. He's put in a camp for 6 years as enemy alien. Never talks about this. His family was completely wiped out in the Holocaust, right? And it's not something he talks about, right? Marcus, on the other hand, believed that you could be German and you could be Muslim and you could also be Jewish. And that's why I wanted to write about him. Not only because he was an unknown figure, but because he thought that you could put all of these different aspects of identity, faith, practice together. Even if he did it in a strange way, even if he did it in a way that was unique for himself, he lived it. And his whole life, he lived these 4 identities. And that's why I found so attractive about this figure. I mean, it's less a biography. I don't really talk about the first 20 years of his life. It's not interesting for me. What happened when he was but when he's 20, also now he becomes an interesting. And then through his life, I was able to write the history of the gay rights movement in Germany, which, unlike what they say in England, is actually the most important, the first gay rights movement. Also, the history of Islam in Germany. It didn't start. I've spent many years living in Germany, and people always believe that Islam came to Germany in 1961 when the first Turkish migrants arrived. It's not like that at all. Why is there that mosque from 1927 then? And who were the German, who was the German Jewish guy who helped bring it about? Right. So I want to push back the date of the gay rights movement. Also, the way the gay rights movement is discussed in Germany today as well. It also has a lot of what's the word? Blind spots.
Mhm.
And the fact that some people have been left out of that story. Let's just put it that way. It's a very white history in Germany. The way they tell the gay rights, it's a very male white story. And there have been other people who've been involved in making it happen. So I wanted to push the clock back and include other people on that. And then regarding the history of German Jews, again, too, obviously my sympathies lie with someone like Kurt Hiller, who's a socialist, and, the Nazis in 1938, or even before that, they beat him almost to death in a concentration camp. He flees to London. He comes back to Hamburg after the war and writes, you all should read his 2-volume autobiography, actually, which is incredible. But so it would have been easier for me to write about someone who is so obvious and we all know about, someone who I like. I don't always like Marcus. He's a German patriot. To the end, despite everything, despite the way he's treated, to the end, he's gonna be German, right?
Then I realize I have one follow-up question. Speaking of to the end, can you talk again? A really poignant part about the book is the conclusion. Can you talk a bit about his death and what happened to him, at the very end of his life? I think it's also kind of important.
Yeah, I wonder what aspect you're wondering about. He goes into Swiss exile in 1939. He lives a very long life. He passes away in 1966.
I was interested literally in where his body is.
Oh, right. So in 1966 in Switzerland, there wasn't a single Muslim cemetery. He spends all those years in Basel. I don't know if you've been to Basel. It's a beautiful city. It's an intriguing city, university city. So he also, which is interesting, he has no one to take care of him when he dies. His cousin in Zurich has passed away, and her husband. He has no family, of course. His Muslim contacts have also passed away. He lives very long. They supported him. They kept sending him money in Switzerland until the 1950s, actually. Mm-hmm. Okay, so he's all alone. He dies in a hospice, a Christian hospice. I've been there in Basel, had a look at it. So he's someone without anyone to claim the body. So they take him to the largest cemetery in Basel, Am Hörnli, and they cremate him. And then they scatter his remains in a forest, which is part of the cemetery, where they scatter the remains of people who don't have any family. And so I feel that's it's quite touching. Today that cemetery has a Muslim section where he might have been buried. But so at the end of the book, I talk about there's a statue there in that part of the cemetery of a mother embracing her child, which I feel is something, because he was very close to his mother, who was buried in a Jewish cemetery in Zurich.
Thank you. That's what I wanted I wanted you to tell about that grave. Mm-hmm. So we have time for questions and discussion, and I hope you'll be willing to take any questions. So someone will help us with a microphone. So let me know if you have any questions, responses, or comments.
But the book has not yet been translated into German.
But is it being?
Interesting story, very briefly.
Yes.
So a well-known gay publishing house in Berlin told me that they're very excited that I'd rediscovered Hugo Marcus, and they published a volume they republished a lot of his writings from the 20s through the 60s. So they came out with this actual, it's in German, obviously, all the original writings, but I noticed that there are very few Muslim writings in there. It was, his gay writings and his philosophy, a lot on the philosophy, which is, I don't talk as much about his philosophy because I'm not a philosopher. So I said, okay, so why did you not include many of his Muslim writings? And they said, well, we just didn't want to. Then I said, okay, since you went to all this effort to republish his writings, since you're so interested in this gay figure, why don't you translate my book? And they said, no, we're not going to translate it because we'd have to change what you write.
Oh,
We'd have to change your argument. And I said, what do you mean by that? You know, I said, why that would not be a translation, that would be interpretation. They said, well, we don't like your emphasis on the Muslim part, you know. So there it is, right there. You have it, right there, open. So I said, well, write your own book, write your own biography, right?